Thank you, Henri.
Apologies. I mean, I think that's one of the crises now in this era. I still draw by hand, so apologies for that. You can see the effect on my talk. Okay, so in terms of those images that you see on the screen, the theme of the talk really straddles practice and research, and I'm a strong believer in reflective practice, meaning that you learn in the process of doing, and then you share those ideas with others. So I very much support the idea of this sort of wider forum, because I think there's a sort of a reluctance of practitioners to talk about their work. Things are very politicized, although a lot of the work that is done is commercial, and it creates a problem in its own way. Ludwig mentioned our practice being Cape Town based. For a very long time, we've been practicing around this environment, which is Long Street, which is it's one of those beautiful streets, which is if one moves up and down the street, there are all these buildings. But ultimately, if you ask me, to talk about any specific building, I probably wouldn't be able to. One always thinks about this as a whole, and I strongly believe that if you build better streets, then you build better cities. If that's the priority, we get all the other benefits that come with building cities. So the talk is very much related to architecture in context and how our practices work has been influenced, the architecture work, by an urban design focus and an urban design awareness. This is a series of drawings from the first stage entry for the Kimberley competition, for which Ludwig Hansen's practice did the framework. The images shows something which is unlikely. It's building something very dense and compact in a very low density environment, talking about the Northern Cape, which is the least dense populated province of all our 9 provinces. And so the opportunity is really remarkable from scratch, saying that if you start off in a place like Kimberley, thinking about the future, and there's an opportunity to build a campus, how would you do it with all these sustainability principles in mind, and density being one of the key aspects of it? If one imagines how all campuses, almost all campuses in South Africa has been built in the past, has been detached, removed, and typically campuses, not city universities. This drawing is from the second stage of the competition. The drawing really shows how the framework that was presented to the participants forced everybody to think about buildings in context. Without even knowing which buildings we would eventually do, we had to present a proposal in which we demonstrated an attitude towards building in cities, or rather in Kimberley in this case. So that the model that you see is not the building that we eventually built. We built other buildings, but I'll get back to that. Also in stage 1, there was the opportunity to do research, to think about the Northern Cape, to think about its climate, to think about the vernacular, and to absorb all those things in a different way than one would usually get involved in a project, where often from stage 1, one is under pressure to produce quantities, areas, parking ratios, confirmation with policy, approvals processes, and so on. So the competition in that sense was fantastic, to give us the space to think about this before we even knew that we had a job. And if one can apply that culture on all projects, that would obviously be fantastic. That we don't always have that benefit. Some more drawings from the, I think this was also a second stage competition entry. I'm talking about first stage and second stage, meaning the first stage was an open stage. Every architect registered in South Africa could participate, and the format was 10 A4 sheets, which is also, again, manageable, and I literally did that on my kitchen table. When we got to the second stage, it was down to 6 A1 sheets, if I remember correctly, which gave us opportunity to think more about the problem, but in the context of a specific building, which we were given a footprint, which we were given. And then after the results were known, we were dispersed onto different sites, meaning that we didn't even build the building that we did in the second round, which is a very sort of innovative way of I believe, doing competitions, is forcing people to think beyond their own buildings, to think about context and responsiveness. If you look at these drawings, it's also about the lightness of things. If you build on a campus, there's the joy of student life, there's the joy of living, of being in cities, And a sense of humor is required in these things too. Often things become so serious, and when one does competitions, you don't have that pressure. So you can apply those things much easier, because you're really, firstly, practicing your own hand, and you don't have all these people looking over your shoulder. You just have principals looking over your shoulder in the process of developing the ideas. With all universities, all campuses, ultimately it's about, not ultimately, but the narrow definition of building a campus is to provide teaching facilities. And we know at the moment, all of you are sitting at home in different spaces, you're not even at university. And the talk I'm going to be giving, or that I'm busy with, really talks to that too. What is there beyond the formal teaching facilities, which is always going to be the focus, the anchor? In the shopping mall, you'll have the Pick and Pay being the anchor. Here you have these classrooms, but they're also sources of energy and movement, and they're anchors in space. So they're much more, their potential is much more than their physical extent. There's another one, that's a 75-seater lecture theatre. That was on the top right, that's a lab space. On the left, that's a 180 or 190-seater auditorium. And those are all inside buildings that we designed. But I'm going to be zooming out. And so we'll be getting back to these, but I'm going to zoom out for a bit. This is really the challenge. This is a beautiful drawing by Peter Barber. He gave a talk at the AZA conference in 2018 in Pretoria, those of you that attended. I've been aware of Peter's work for a long time, and I actually met him in London probably 20 years ago now, while he was still emergent. And he's always had this way of running a practice by doing research on the side and publishing those, and now using social media and so on. This drawing really talks to a lot of our problems in South Africa. We've got a big country with a lot of land, but yet we can't afford to scatter things around the landscape willy-nilly. We need to start looking at compactness, density, and within that, imagine being an architect working within this sort of diagram that you see on the screen, the 80-20, meaning that you've got 20% open space, 80% really dense, and then you start looking at sustainable densities. I'm sitting here in the inner city of Cape Town, which is supposed to be dense, but it's not really dense by world standards. So Peter is doing these provocative drawings in the 1,000-mile city and so on around the green belt of London, saying that we must take it seriously, and it's almost like a Middle Eastern sort of texture and grain that one gets, not very different to the way one should be building in the Northern Cape. Then there's this preoccupation we've had in our practice, and I personally have had, is this way of working where you start with a mass and you carve away. And essentially that's what a density is. You start with a mass, accepting that as a given, and then you carve away. It's not the way that modernist architecture works. That's not the way a lot of commercial architecture in this country works, where it's the object, it's the commodity, and the opportunity to carve away is fairly limited because of our town planning system, historical preoccupation, segregation, and all of those issues come into play. This is what we call Building 8. It's a teacher training facility at Kimberley, and I'm just zooming out slightly. You can see that on the bottom right, the lecture theatre that I showed earlier, in context now within a building, and you can see how the mass of this building is sort of carved back. Top left, you see an image of the full extent, the envelope, which was inherited from Ludwig's framework. And then we started carving back, which was a real joy to do, really. And once one's done that, it's very difficult to look at architecture differently. Where we usually start with a parking grid. You set out the parking grid, that becomes your module. I'm talking about commercial architecture, and then you start stacking stuff on top of it. That becomes the building, and you've got very limited scope. Yeah, there's no parking really on site. It was one of those sort of marvels of working with Ludwig here, that he repelled that sort of temptation to bring the normal, where are our cars? And the answer usually was that we will solve that later, which is the reverse of the way almost all projects start. Is when you submit to councils, one of the first things they check is your parking ratio. But you can see how that massing has now been carved away and how we've stacked it. And this is a physical model. It's not a BIM or a computer model or whatever, because in a way, a building like this, which hasn't got a grid per se, it isn't there, but it doesn't start off with a grid. those sort of repetitive mechanisms don't work that well. And we take a lot of joy in doing bigger buildings where that doesn't become a fix, where BIM doesn't become the master. It's just a tool. So if you look at the stacking going up and then eventually get to the envelope, it's the way that we work. And we can't actually do without the physical model, because we constantly refer to the physical model to explain to ourselves, remind ourselves, and to explain to other people what this building is about. It also is what Venturi would call the difficult whole. It's a complex arrangement, but when it's done, it almost should seem as if it was effortless. And I think that is always the big challenge with architecture. Good architecture seems effortless, but we know behind that there's a lot of effort. This is a different project we're working with, we're on in the city area of Cape Town. It just shows again in our own practice from an urban design perspective, when we do housing or anything of that nature, density is the driver. And then again, one can imagine this being a mass, like that clay block, and then you start carving away, and then you arrive at the buildings. You don't work the other way around. And we, as I said earlier, we enjoy working like that. This is another framework that we're busy with. And in time, your view or our view of architecture and urban design becomes inseparable. And I think that's one of the great things of getting involved in urban design. There are all these terms, urbanism, placemaking, and so on. Ultimately, formal urban design, studying urban design, getting used to the principles. So it becomes a staple. For us, it's become a real joy, because a lot of those other things, for us, it's not closely related enough to architecture and building, but they're just events. Then one looks at this drawing, and I've consciously faded out, I created a watermark of built form at the back. Ultimately, it's about this. It's about maximizing choice for the greatest amount of users. And it's a loaded term, but really it means standing back from the building and not talking about my building or even our buildings. It's a collective, because on a campus of all environments, this is a profound opportunity where those spaces and the life between classes, which is the title of my talk, is really important. The amount of time you spend, and you will know as students, in formal lectures is fairly limited. One's perception of student life, your memories of university is really based on those events and experiences between classes. So those spaces need to be positive spaces. They can't be spaces left over after planning. On the left, you see the GIBS, the Gordon Institute of Business Science, which I did 3 phases of, initially with TC, the Old Taljat Carter architect, which we won in a limited competition, and I was then involved in 2 further phases. But from the outset, it was built around a framework, not just put a building down there and we'll just select the coolest one, and the architect who can present the coolest building, we will build that building. It's always been based on a greater vision, and Nick Benadel had that vision at GIBS, and we had the benefit of a great number of people doing a lot of work at the new universities, making that the default, and someone has to give credit to that principle. This diagram is the sort of mess that is practice, meaning that one doesn't always have a choice where you work and what you do, what you get approached to design, and so in time, as an urbanist architect or an urban design architect, there's a sort of a semblance between house plans even and campuses. So when one looks at a house, which is a small city really, the houses we design have squares, they've got avenues, they've got vistas, they've got sort of served and servant spaces, and those things become intermingled over time. So in a way, we can't design a house which is an object in any case. We've moved along. If one looks at the plan of Rome, this fantastic drawing of 1748 by the knowledge map of Rome, it's a fantastic drawing. Initially, I was intimidated. I remember as an architecture student, intimidated by this drawing, this very busy, large drawing of Rome. And I've only really been to Rome recently. It's just circumstantial. I've been to many other places, but Rome is one of those places where there's this fantastic balance between object and space, and one can enter these objects like the Pantheon, But generally one's experience is this magic maze of spaces which is not dominated by the car. And if one looks at this drawing, let me just get my laser pointer, which remarkably I found. If one looks at the spaces that flows into buildings is really what is of interest to me as an architect, meaning that one doesn't only have public and private. You've got these two magic layers, semi-public, semi-private, which is really what Rome is about. And I think that's the sad reality of your cities, that things are gated, they're closed off, you drive into basements of office buildings. And even if people call these buildings mixed-use buildings, they're not really mixed-use unless you've got horizontal and vertical mixed use. And again, on campus, you've got that opportunity. Pockets are these spaces off the avenues, the movement axes, or the way people move, are these delightful spaces, these pockets that sit off it, that you discover in time. The first time you go to a city like Rome, you won't even notice some of them. In time, you find them. In London, at the Covent Garden behind the church, the Inigo Jones designed church, there's a space which I only discovered after being in London for, my third time, having studied and worked there before. You discovered one of those spaces. And again, those are the sorts of spaces that are lacking, the positive spaces that are one step off the high street. And if one looks at a design like this, it's those sorts of spaces. And those are really the memorable space. And that's got nothing to do with building. It's actually got to do with the good neighborliness of buildings, how buildings relate to those spaces. Then there's the second pocket, which is at a finer grain scale, which is at the scale of the building. And as I said earlier, one starts talking about buildings as if they are cities. This remarkable picture on the left bottom, taken by Harvey Fagan, who's recently passed away from his airplane. I mean, I've been reading a lot, reflecting on Harvey's life recently, and his fantastic work over a very long period of time. And you look at the drawing on the right, that is Louis Kahn. It's sort of influenced the castles of Scotland. My heritage is in Scotland, so I've got an affinity for that too. But the way that Kahn saw buildings being served and servant, you get a very clear space, which is almost sacrosanct in its geometry. And then you've got these things coming off it, carved out of the edge and the thickening of the walls. And I think in our climate, we've got the opportunity to thicken walls, and we've got these flimsy buildings. I call them SketchUp buildings all over now. Everything just gets stuck onto very light frames, and the opportunity to indulge really in the sort of opportunity of carving away. And as you can see on the left here, also part of the vernaculars of the Northern Cape, and we'll get back to that. This is just a bit of a detour into a pocket in a house. There's a door to a house, and the door is closed, but there's sort of an anticipation and expectation of something that follows, and then the door opens, and there's another layer, and one sees into the layer, and you get certain glimpses of what lies beyond. Light at the end. It's also a way one would look at a city moving down a street, and there's a square at the end, and you start getting that sort of a sense of excitement. You want to get to that square, but as the next door opens, light catches your eye, and you can see a different order. Initially, you were just aware of the main order running down the house, the central axis. You become aware of another order, the lateral order. And those are often the more interesting spaces for me. And so that the talk really is about that importance of not the full frontal stuff, not the main elements, but the serendipity, those sort of opportunities for discovery. And then if you look a bit further, you see a step on the right-hand side, the sort of anticipation created by that step. And then you turn right, you look into that space, and there's the stair, and then light starts playing a role. But you can see the rail leading you to the next space, and then the next space. And I'm not going to take you further up the stair, because like Adolf Loos, I believe one has to visit buildings to understand them. So this building is full of spaces like this. But for these spaces to work, you need the main order. So it's juxtaposed against the main order. And this is the pocket that I'm talking about. And it's the same pocket one finds in cities, or you can find them in cities, but if we don't design them, they won't originate. I always say with thesis students, selection of sites and so on, and projects, students tend to want to do something which is spectacular. And if you listen to podcasts of David Chipperfield, I really love listening to him. He says we shouldn't be blown away by architecture. We should be fond of architecture. And that's the spirit in which we try to do architecture. It's not blowing anybody away, but creating a timeless sort of experience that will be there forever. Okay, so if one looks at a house, this is a different house that we did. Is not the previous one, and this one is a sort of fairly well published or broadly published house in the Cape Winelands. But if you look on the inside of a house like that, this is really what we're pursuing, and it's those pockets, and it's the delight of the use of light, and it's the sort of principles that Louis Kahn spoke about, that once you take the light away, these spaces aren't the same, that they would be otherwise. And the fantastic opportunity to use light as something dynamic, patterns that move, morning experience being different to evening experience or late afternoon experience, but also the opportunity to frame views out. So you're sitting on the inside looking out, not on the outside looking in and admiring the architect's work as an object. And as I said earlier, that's very much an urban designer's way of looking at things. And it takes a long time to develop this sort of, to feel comfortable with this work, because you always have to find ways of convincing your client, because it's very difficult. How would I sell this typically to a client? Saying, are you crazy? You're going to sell me a big white box, are you? Because that's all I can see on the drawing. In your mind, you've got spaces like this. And it takes time to do what Adolf Loos calls the round plan or the space plan design. Carving, sculpting space takes a lot of time and effort. Then refinement and essence. I spoke about Harvey Fagan a bit earlier. If one looks at these two houses, they were designed at the same, not the same. The architects were the same age. So on the right-hand side, you've got Harvey Fagan, 1951. At 25 years, he was 25 years old, house for his parents. On the left, there's a house by Richard Rogers, who's recently retired from his practice. I think he's 87. Harvey passed away at 95, 97, and 1970. And then you look at these drawings or these pictures of these houses today, they're absolutely timeless. And those are examples for me, or inspirations, to architects that for their entire careers pursued their passion and a very specific way of looking at things. We're living in an era of Instagram, of social media, of information overload, where it's very easy to become confused. So I've got great admiration for architects that have been practicing. In Harvey's case, this is 70 years ago, and this house could be, it's still a good house. It still does all the things it does. If you look at Rogers, he's taken that through scales to the Pompidou Center, but it's still Rogers, and you can still recognize that. And then also the love for detail, that if you're always busy changing form, externally, meaning it's a circle or a star or whatever you want to call it, the coolness on the outside, you actually rob yourself of the benefit of getting to the level of refinement. And it's just beautiful, simple details, not look at me, best sort of detail, everything. It's just the passion, just sort of integral to this image, and the simplicity of things. The joy of constraint, I spoke about Chipperfield earlier. These are drawings by Chipperfield, just a quick case study. If one has to design a house in that context, what would you do? And there's sort of, you can see quite severe constraints, and I suppose in this context, I don't know all the detail, protocols, regulations, codes, heritage, whatever. How would you respond in a context like this? And so it's really how do you become a good neighbor in that context? So this is the house, but really you can't actually imagine this house without its context. And if you look at that sort of broadening of that view of that house, you can see how beautifully Chipperfield responded to the immediate context. And again, I said earlier, if you don't confine your effort, you will never get to this. If it's all about just the instant flash, you will never get to this. So you saw the drawings earlier of Chipperfield redrawing and redrawing and redrawing this connection between the house and its neighbors, until it just made perfect sense. It's one of my favorite projects. And if you look at the back, it's even more profound. If you see how the lines have been taken up, and that's really what urban design is about, responding, not imposing. So this is a small piece of urban design. It's no coincidence that Chipperfield's urban work, much bigger projects are equally successful. So, and next point, Raamplan. This is the Adolf Loos approach to design. As I said earlier, it's what the defining thing of a Raamplan building is. If you move a section a millimeter, it's a different section. So this thing about having if one thinks about Glenn Murcutt's work, for instance, you develop a section, you extrude it, and that becomes the building. This is a very different way of working. That has its own merits. This is a different way of working. I suppose they're both equally difficult, but I enjoy, and our practice enjoys that. And you can see on the left how we work with that principle. A very simple envelope, but a complex interior of the spiral plan. On campuses, Herzberger comes into play, this opportunity for students to interact across space diagonally. So you're not just thinking about plan or section. Again, it's a bit like the Raamplan. It's about this connectedness between spaces and the promenade condition that is integrated into this. So again, you can see in our work, that's exactly what we do. We think about the promenade, but to see the promenade, you must actually think and draw and model and get to grips to it. Then the purpose of frameworks. This is, as you can see, a chessboard. We all know a chessboard for what it is. It's just a series of grids. But it's about the game. The board is important, but the game is important, and the relationship between all these pieces and the space that is the chessboard is important. But then if you let architects loose, some architects on the right, they would want to redesign the chessboard. The chessboard does what it needs to do. You don't have to reinvent it. So you can also redesign the chess pieces and so on, but ultimately you're not going to win the game because you've got a cool chessboard or you've got a cool king, whatever. On the left, it doesn't make any sense changing that grid into something illogical in terms of what the game wants, and that's planning. Often planning becomes convoluted, all the paraphernalia, that's sort of all the baggage around planning, which will never create the places that we enjoy and love. So again, the essence is something that I think one has to get back to. And we've got no interest in doing the buildings on the right. We've never had, but yet that becomes the default in large parts of the city. And unfortunately, that's aspiration of many architects to do a building like that. I think through urban design, one sort of immediately one wants to step away from that and just work through them, go through the motions and the everyday stuff. An urban grid, a very simple urban grid like that, why mess with it? The whole New York is built like that, and if you take one piece away, it creates all sorts of opportunities that the grid itself generates. Without the grid, you can't have the void. So these things go hand in hand. So if one looks at that, if it's a simple perimeter block building, within that frame, that mass, that block of clay, this becomes possible. There are endless opportunities to discover and design within it without changing the form. Just stick to the form that fits into the city. This is another exercise for an urban corner. If you've got an urban corner, the way you deal with a corner, it doesn't kill architecture. There's a lot of joy in architecture, in crafting at that scale. So we've spoken about the pocket, which is a sort of a sub-space, and now you talk about the corner, which is a sub-element, and those are really the typological components that we enjoy working on. Back to, we're going to run out of time. If I run out of time, I'll just skip through some of the slides. But we've got too many.
Henri, there is time. Henri, just relax.
There is time. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll pace myself back. Thanks, Ludwig. Okay, on the left, there's Ludwig's framework for Kimberley. I'm not going to contextualize it within Kimberley. I've spoken about the idea to densify. It is dense. You can see the compactness of the form, and it relates to the chessboard and the grid, the urban grid that I spoke about earlier. And what Ludwig did is he said, well, it's all about the spaces between buildings. And without really understanding himself, what will go into these buildings, this became the dominant order. And we've through many years of working urban design realized that if you fix it and you've got a program, you will get it to fit somehow. You just work backwards from that form, and if it doesn't fit, it's more important to keep that envelope than to start pushing out and to start ruining the spaces in between. Because really, I mean, if I work in the city center of Cape Town and somebody said, well, we've demolished the building here, you can build a new building, that's the fix. You are actually stuck with that space, and that's how cities have been designed forever. But somehow in this country and other new world countries, we think that's not really about the space. It's about what the building wants to be. And so you're always looking for this open site, this place where you can exert that freedom. So the framework was for us an absolute joy to work within. And I was always, and I think Ludwig will vouch for it, I always said, well, don't mess with the envelope. Just work within the envelope and accept the framework, because we found, even with the competition that Ludwig launched, actually the Department of Education was that those footprints should remain the same, and one shouldn't change too much, because there's a future greater than these footprints themselves. So inside these footprints, you start getting different architects to work within these footprints, and you can see a very early model. Ludwig printed a base, and then the different architects came to a workshop in Johannesburg, and we had pieces of models in different stages of development. And on the right-hand side, you can see the knowledge map, which we did ourselves. We got the drawings from all the architects. I was just interested in that as a bit of research on the side. And you can see how remarkably the detail is now sort of superimposed onto what started off as just these blocks of clay, and how all the architects conform to that. So it was really about testing it. The competition was really about testing an attitude and a level of acceptance of frameworks. And what I wanted to say earlier, and I lost my track there, is that I spoke to many architects who participated in the competition that wanted to trash the framework, saying, oh, that framework is rubbish, they should have done it like this. And then they redid the framework in the context of doing the competition. Whereas that was never our intention. We always said, well, how can you demonstrate if that is your fix? How do you work within it? And while I'm on that topic, I think with university projects, there should be framework given to students, and they should be tested on their ability to work within frameworks. Not for all students to every time redo the frameworks, because in practice, that's one of the big problems we've got, is that you do frameworks, and then the first thing is the architects start questioning the framework. They must demonstrate how they conform. Their skill doesn't lie in questioning the framework, because that's what cities are about. So just in terms of those models, a slightly bigger one, and you can see the massing there. And then if you take out one of our footprints, which is that group there, you can see how we've really battled with proportion, massing, and even if there's not a lot of change between two versions, we still did it. And so the physical model as a piece that you plug in becomes very important, and then to constantly test its ability to work in its context, not on its own, work in context, and how it supports the spaces around it. So you can see the watermark now overlaid on there, and that sort of subtracted detail. And then on the right-hand side, we're back to GIBS, the Gordon Institute of Business Science. Most of you are in Joburg. I also believe it's one of those buildings you have to visit to really understand. It's not, you can't even see the building from the street. It's all sort of internalized, but it's all about these pockets, and you can all again see the movement and the axis and the messiness, the overlay, which gives it life. So the buildings are a backdrop to student life on the GIB campus. And it's been designed in different styles. The first style was more postmodern. It's got some postmodern tricks in it. The latter phases are much more modernist, or primitive modern, as I'd like to call it. It's sort of simple in its expression. And you can see the same space, just a general day at the office. and a group of students visiting on a different day. So every time I go there, it's different because of its use. If one looks at the floor plan of Gibbs, it's not a building. It's impossible to call this a building. It's really a little piece of city. And again, through urban design, formal urban design studies, these things become part of your reference. You can see the axes running through it. But when we did, this is the first phase around here, and then this phase followed, and there was another phase. We didn't know what the program was when we did phase 2 or phase 3. But what we did know from the beginning is that the campus was going to grow. And so you can see how it just latches onto these axes. Without these axes, it would have been very difficult to make it legible. And these were, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in this case, 5 suburban stands that were consolidated and redeveloped. And that's where this footprint comes from. But it's a bit like Kimberley. You do it properly and you densify properly, and it's not about a building, a campus as a building. It's an environment. It's a total environment. If one looks at Kimberley, what I wanted to show you with the pink bits is that's where the formal lecture theatres are. Those are the anchors. But equally important is all the rest. And all of those spaces are accessible to students. You don't just arrive, open the door in a lecture theatre. You arrive and you meet your friends, you bump into your lecturers. You can even come from the outside, have lunch here as a visitor. And so that it's again the total environment. If you look at Kimberley, same thing. You've got these, and they're not absolutely accurate, but you can see the formal lecturing facilities dispersed throughout the campus. And this forces students to move through, not forces probably the wrong word, it's just the fact that these things are dispersed gives much more potency to the in-between. And again, these are all positive spaces related to these formal environments. And now with COVID, these spaces are much more important than they were before, because really they are the breathing spaces, the spaces of choice. Okay, so I've spoken about those and the messiness and the layers over them, which is really what it's about, which is the real legacy. Then choice and action. If one looks at those images, I went to it's actually a photographer. Went to Dave Southworth, went to the site on a Saturday morning. Unfortunately, not a lot of people there. But it's on the Kimberley campus in front of a building that we designed, which is that building highlighted in red. And you can see the arrow where the camera was set up for 35 minutes. I have to turn the building on its head really to understand what this is about. The building was designed in response to a movement axis that comes from town and then diverts. This is almost like those of you know what a pinball machine is, it's almost like a pinball flipper. It flips you and you move down there. So the building speaks and receives you and also guides you on the route to the remainder of the campus. So turning it on its back, really, it's a method used in the 80s, 70s. James Sterling used this quite often. The worm's eye view, they're very difficult to read, but you can see the figure ground drawing superimposed and that massing sitting within it. And you can see our round plan type building, which is mass driven, and the block of clay that we carved into. There's the movement system that goes through the building. It's possible to actually move through the building, or you can move in front of it. Okay, so this is, I'll just see if this works. If it doesn't work, I'll just move on to the next one. I don't think this is going to work. I've made some freeze frames. Oh, there we go. Okay, so within that sequence of 35 minutes, at 7 minutes, there are people walking in front of the building, and there's sort of nobody there. Then more people appear. Somebody enters that building. There's a guy on a bicycle. I've missed the guy. On the previous slide, you can see somebody peering over the balcony there. And really, that's what, for me, is what a campus building should be about. It's this interaction with the building, moving through it, moving past it. This is an east-facing facade. So in the morning, it's a very popular space. A cold winter's morning, students sit there with their backs against the wall, with the sun on their faces. And then in the afternoon, in this very hot climate, on a summer's day, it's in shade. So it's equally popular. And then obviously those trees at some point will become mature, and it'll be even a nicer space. And then and what you probably didn't see was how the shadow moves. If you look at, within a space of 36 minutes, that shadow moves, and there's an ability to animate building in this fantastic sort of climate that we've got, and the opportunity of the Northern Cape, the crisp light, to work with that as well. Then in terms of relative space and thresholds, just the animation I did, you've seen that image before of somebody entering a space. What does it mean? This is a private space generally, but if you change the scale, it becomes public. It says I'm public, and at building 8 in Kimberley, that's the scale of the entrance. That's a different view. This is building 5, the other smaller footprint we did, the same thing. So there's an ability to work with relative scale in these spaces. A typical, just a shop window, you see that sort of a shop window. It could be in a city, on a street. A commercial building would have floor plates in it. The opportunity with a campus building is that you're dealing with this idea of a promenade, of students entering that space, moving into those spaces. And you can see that similarity between what you see on the model there and that there. And then there's another layer appearing, and there's the suspense that one works with. And you can see that layer represented on the image on the left. Another layer appears, and then there's a landscape beyond. And it's this movement through space, the promenade going from public through semi-public, through semi-private, and to private sometimes on a campus, but it's not really about that. And those opportunities are the layers that we like to explore in our architecture at all scales, whether it's at an urban scale or a residential scale. And then the people comes into play. And ultimately, we design for those people, the people moving into those spaces and enjoying those spaces. And the chance encounters, as Christopher Alexander calls it, city is not a tree, that SOVs. And then the landscape layer with it. So the frame is very simple. But the level of experience is very complex. So if you complicate the origins, you overcomplicate things. You make them too cumbersome. So we believe one has to make these things very simple and very legible, and then you put these layers on, and that's where things really happen and come to life. And then you add the light, which is something which is always important in our work. Once one's worked in Europe, you realize what a gift it is for us in Africa to work with light, the abundance of light. And then the proportion and scale thing. I referred to Harvey Fagan's work earlier. This love for proportion and crafting things so that they're just the right size is the other layer. Just a quick case study. We got a call one day to say urban design work required on a building in Cape Town. It ended up being that building, and was a concern about a piece of land in front of the building. It's the footprint that you see there, the red building. Not a very nice building, but it was due to be redeveloped, and the city owned a piece of land in front of the building between those two big blocks. And they said, no, well, if this building gets redeveloped and it wants more parking, then we need to engage in a trade-off, and something needs to be given back to the city. So this is the space that we found. It's quite a nasty space. A typical 80s sort of detailing with those panels, but really very bad in terms of its spatial quality. Where the dotted line says this is public land in front of the building. It's always been for historic reasons, which I've never actually understood. This is public, and so the city said, if you want to redevelop, you have to do it with urban design input and improve that space. So this is what the space looks like today. That's what it looked like. And this is what it looks like today. And this is urban design's influence. Without the urban design influence, this would not have happened, because all the building money would have just been spent on the building itself, on its envelope, not on this deepening on the relative scale. So you can see that space indenting. Then we said if you want to put parking on top here, use air rights, but you carve back and you have to create 2 columns and a big truss, and you can see that happening. So through the urban design department of the city's insistence, we developed this charrette process over 8 weeks, and then Burgertman did the detailed design, and Studio One did the landscaping. And so we said, no, you need a canopy of scale at the scale of the city over that space, which was calculated in terms of the sun angles. And then one zooms in further, and then, as I said, you get this quality of space. In the foreshore, which is not a very nice environment, people think Cape Town is magic. That's a very bad part of Cape Town. It's just disjointed buildings floating in space, modernist sort of infrastructure. Okay, so done. This is, I spoke about confining things, setting limits for yourself, not absorbing everything, not accepting everything, not being influenced by everything. The word influencer for me is a problem. If you asked Harvey Fagan if he thought he was an influencer, he would say no. If you asked Richard Rogers, he would say no. They become influencers through their work by default, not by demanding that tag or bring that tag to their own CV. This building, building 5, I'll just quickly take you through a tour. And as I said earlier, one actually has to visit buildings to appreciate them, and that applies to all buildings. So these are 2 buildings that we designed. You've seen the top one. The bottom one is the smaller of the 2, and we waited longest for the design of that, or building of it, but it was actually designed first. So in the sequence of building in Kimberley within the framework, that's an historic building, William Prescott building. Then the second series of buildings were built there. Then we designed our first building there. Then another building was built there. We then built that building there. And Petty Moriele is building that building there, his practice. So he may have spoken about that building in his lecture. But what it says is, at the time that you design this building, you partially respond to a surrogate context, which is the framework, and you partially respond to a real context. And for us, it was interesting because our work straddled those, because we didn't do the first building. So we could respond to buildings already built, and we could respond to the framework. So this is the shape of the small triangular building. This is the detailed plan, taking the walls that was done with a lot of effort in the office by my partner Amali Comrie and Etienne Brits over a long time, and several others. And you see what I've done here is I'm referring to the Louis Kahn influence of the thickened wall, those pockets. And if you look at served and servant spaces, this is what the plan ends up looking like. So you've got all those functional areas that are excluded, and then you've got this space, which is actually an extension of the public domain. So this is the semi-public space, and then you enter into these spaces. But the building, there's a fluidity between inside and outside in the design of the building. Testing its massing in space. And then again, as I said earlier, the tension or the opportunity that lies between the public domain and the formal lecture theatres, all those layers in between are really for us what it's about. And you can see the campus coming together here. It's really exciting, and it'll only get better with time as the landscape settles. So this little building here, triangular building, is not a very big building, 2,500 square meters usable space. Sits lodged between other buildings, and as I said earlier, these buildings were built by the time we built that one there. So you can see the composition and the containment of space, which the framework makes possible, and these buildings just displaying good manners and ultimately trying to create a very nice avenue for as a legacy, really, which is really the exciting part here. Khan, Ahmedabad. That sort of space and time and things are mature, and the rawness of the bricks and the material is part of the success, I believe, of the Kimberley campus. If you look at the materiality, it's not overly fussy. It's also affordable, and why not? So if one looks at the way one enters this building, there are different ways of entering, but the formal entrance is off a park that faces south, or the building faces onto a park, and this is the south-facing elevation. about the exploration, then the materiality, the rawness of the material. This is a particularly nice picture because of the angle of the sun, just sort of bringing out the texture of the brick. But you can see the reference to the solidity of the vernaculars in the Northern Cape. It's something that was taken on board from the outset, that you work with that, and so that the building looks like it's in the Northern Cape. It doesn't look like it's in KZN or in Gauteng. Some more of the detail. I just need to thank Christa Billett for all these pictures. We haven't had professional pictures taken yet because of COVID. We haven't been back there really since the building's been completed. So we had to make do with these pictures from Chris, but they're really great. Thanks, Chris, if you logged in. You can see the outside of this building, which is this mass which we carved back into, and really this thing coming to life, which lived in a model for a very long time in the office. And as I said earlier, the building should actually be visited to be experienced, but this tension between permeability and solidity is something that we worked with. And then I spoke about the pockets earlier, this carving away. I'm not going to bore you with going through the plans, but you can see the lecture theatre on the ground floor on the right here, which actually takes 2 levels of the building inside, and then there are 2 further levels within the envelope that we were given, that were filled with office and admin facilities. But really it's about moving off the little public square on the outside into this facility, and then exiting, so that the upper levels are really more private and the lower levels are really very public in their use. So if one enters the building through that big slot, and I spoke about the scale earlier, it gets pinched, and this is the first view you get. No students in the building, as you can see, because of COVID, unfortunately. I'd love to have pictures of the whole building filled with life. This is the first glimpse you see, and then you cast your eye up a bit more and more into that space. And one of the real pleasures of working in public building, you don't squeeze square meters into every space, and you work with assignable space, meaning that these spaces are really all usable on the ground floor. But in the context of the campus, it's really a very small area. And so if you look at that space on the total footprint, it's that area there. But we worked within that volume, carved it out, and used the ramplan and the promenade architecture. And I can imagine students being in all these spaces, on these balconies, looking back down on these on the promenade space leading into the auditorium, looking back into the space, and so on. The main auditorium space, you've seen it several times now, and then just testing the seating. But again, it's an unpretentious space. We just focused on the space and kept the detail to the bare essence, and again the integrity of the use of material, so that things don't age, and it's easy to maintain. The white of the building is conscious, because these are contained spaces. The outside is the brick, as you can see, but once you move into the building, we work with white, and sure, it's going to be sort of need to be maintained, but really that coat of paint, it's worth it. If one had to saturate it with dark colors and all sorts of, it wouldn't have been the same thing. And you can see the secondary light coming in. This is a sliding hatch into the main auditorium, with which Comrie detailed. And you can see how light comes in from the outside. There's a puncture in the outer skin, and if you want to darken it, you just slide that thing across. It's just one of the gimmicks in the building. In that shade space again, I put a little arrow on the plan on the left every time. It's not that easy to follow. Again, as I said, one has to actually visit the building. Then going up towards the auditorium and looking back. At the moment, this photograph was taken when the building was still sealed off the dust created by Mpeti's building on the other side there. So only recently have they taken that off. The experience will be totally different once that temporary sort of shield is off it. And the seats, these are all communal spaces, usable spaces really in the context of a campus. And then if one looks back down, this is what you see in the space. Looking up, and you can see again our preoccupation with light and controlled light in the manner of Louis Kahn. that you don't bring in the light in a too obvious way. You bring it in a subtle way, in a way that creates shifts in the experience as the light moves across that skylight. The mood inside the building changes. You can see on the top left of the picture, that same picture, that same roof light. And this is the space moving up towards the lobby of the auditorium space. This is actually the auditorium's lobby on the top floor. Just a bit of a hole to peep through back into the big space. And the shifting experience because of the way that the plan was made. So that view really is on the model there. Going up the stairs to the auditorium. The more functional spaces. And then imperfection. I spoke about things needing to be, we like the idea of imperfection. This is what we saw. Amalie and I visited La Tourette. We had a laugh at this, and then Amalie did a site visit and she found that. So just sort of a coincidence. But and then the contractor said, Jean was a fantastic foreman, Jean Meyer, said, can you fix it? And Amalie said, no, please just leave it like that. So the imperfection is something that I think one should also not embrace, but we shouldn't be too fussy. If the spaces work, everything doesn't have to be polished. Okay, so Ludwig, thanks a lot. I think that's it from in terms of the formal presentations. I'll just exit this.
Yes, thank you very much, Henri, and your team at URBA. I think that was fantastic. I think there was obvious delight in all the work and the exploration of the space making and the sculpting of it, and the fluidity of space and its relations to the surrounding environment and context is an obvious delight. And I think the animation of the form is an absolute, I think a good example as to how also our students sometimes overcomplicate the design from the front rather than starting on a simple manner and then layering it rather than starting with complex forms. They might just shoot me later in studio for saying that over and over again. So I think I'm going to, Henri, we always have some queries and questions maybe for exploration. I think there's someone who has a raised hand. It's Andronica. If you want to maybe ask your query, followed by Lionel.
Thank you, Henri, for the great presentation. What I'd like to ask in terms of your presentation, I saw that you also touched a bit on coding. Yeah, so I'm currently dealing with coding in my Masters of Urban Design. So I'd like to ask you something that I didn't really pick up, or I would like you to explain further in terms of like urban architecture and code. For example, the landscaping part and the roadscapes within the environment, because I noticed that you said for good urban design we have to have like good streets and then buildings follow. So in terms of coding, how would you code in terms of urban architecture? I don't know if my question is clear enough. Thank you.
Yeah, I can try to answer that. Firstly, I think code is something that is actually embedded in cities as it is. So a code is simply something that we've extracted as urban designers, and we describe those things because what we've realized as urban designers, and essentially urban design is a conservative pursuit. And not in the sense of the fear clear. I'm talking about conservative in terms of respecting the past and the way that people have built cities in the past. So the code is really describing things so that they work. And I remember Paul Moraine once saying, and Paul Moraine, Ludwig knows Paul Moraine quite well. He said, architects are so rubbish at what they do that you have to have that stick, saying that they mess up things without reminding them of those rules. So the code, when we do urban design work, we in a way insist on coding. The clients, if it's a private sector client, is not always prepared to pay for it because it's a lot of work. It's the working drawings of urban design. So you have to describe everything. You have to give heights, you have to give setbacks and so on. But we've realized that if architects, initially there's a reluctance. Once they've bridged that sort of, step beyond their ego and they start working with the code, they actually enjoy it because they don't have to do a million form options. They just simply work within those rules. And those of you who don't know code, I would encourage you to do a bit of research around what a code is, because it's like a framework. People are intimidated by the term framework. Well, it shouldn't be. It's actually very simple, straightforward set of rules. And a code for me is really just about building the edge of a street better. It's all really about the street, that interface, and it's the bottom 5 meters or 10 meters of a building. That's what it's all about. And if you go to Sandton, that's where everything fails. It's in that bottom 5 to 10 meters and the proximity of built form to the street and how that sort of relationship to human scale works. So just to answer your question, I'm fully supportive of codes, and we code whenever we need to. And we did work within a code here, a code that Ludwig set up. And one can sort of question the detail in a code. Sometimes one could say, well, these things are overcode. That's a different discussion. But certainly, the idea of a code is not something that you can sort of just employ throughout your studies at university, for instance, because that's the problem often with not the problem. The nice thing too about studying architecture is that some lecturers will tell you coding, that's just rubbish. That's what the urban designers do. But at least once in your studies, somewhere in your 4th year or even your 1st year, to be exposed to it, it's fantastic. I think it's necessary for students to get used to that idea of working within control.
Thanks, Andronica. Lionel?
Yes, hi, Henry. Thank you very much. My question is specifically for the students where, given our increased reliance on BIM tools, the model building process is very often left to the very end and usually reserved purely for presentation purposes. So my question to you is, throughout the growth of your career, has your approach to how you use physical models to interrogate design changed?
Yeah, just in terms of BIM, we've been using BIM when we've been forced to use it. And I think that's becoming, unfortunately, something you can't actually dodge. Because you start working on a project like Kimberley, and then everybody tells you you should be on Revit or you should be on this, and it was quite interesting in the beginning of Kimberley that I remember Andrew Macon saying, well, we only work on ArchiCAD, and that's what we do. We're not going to change. We're not going to work on Revit. So I think it's still a choice, and I think it should remain a choice for as long as possible for us, at least. That if one works in what I call a stereoatomic fashion, meaning that you put elements together. And I mentioned Richard Rogers earlier. That sort of building is suited to BIM. It's got the systems, it deals with efficiencies all the time. But if you've got an artistic approach to architecture like I've got, and I'm not afraid to say that I'm an artist type architect, meaning that I enjoy the craft of architecture. And somebody said the other day, but what's the difference between craft and design? I think that distinction is becoming more and more evident now, because if you ask me what Harvey Fagan was, he was a craftsman. He loved the making of things, touching them, molding them, and so on. For me, BIM becomes alienating because I need to wake up in the morning, log in, check the system, and be bullied by it, essentially. So there's a real risk of architecture paying a heavy price if everything is about efficiency. So sure, its purpose is to make things more efficient. But if the world is just about efficiency, then we're in trouble. And I think that's what COVID has also taught us. We've all been forced to stand still now, to reflect and think about things differently. And ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, these campuses are fantastic because of the experience made possible by a framework which has nothing to do with BIM. Those footprints and the arrangement comes from an awareness of space. And that awareness of space, BIM can't tell you. It can't teach you that. The awareness comes through travel, being passionate about space, about all these discussions we're having now. So again, I don't want to tell anybody don't work on BIM. If you're a big commercial practice, that's the way you make your practice efficient, and how you increase your profit margins. That's large part and parcel of it. But I've also followed the discussion around Revit recently, where a lot of practices in the world have a big problem with what Revit costs. So as a small practice, we're just talking about commercial side of practice now. It's an expensive tool where the drawing board and the hand and the mind is not. So one has to sort of mediate between those things. But I suppose it also relates to the scale of a building. You will not BIM a house. It's stupid to BIM a house. Some people will say, well, it's fantastic. But I can assure you, you will see it in what the house looks like. And certainly, I can't BIM a house. If you ask me, to BIM a house, I'll just say, well, it'll make me inefficient in making the house what I want it to be. So efficiency is a relative term. So this thing about the BIM, Lionel, you asked about my career, is a very recent thing, really. In terms of my career, Ludwig mentioned we've been busy for 30 years. So this thing has come into play in the last 5-10 years, and it's becoming something that as I said earlier, you can't avoid. But I'm too old to change now, to be honest. So I don't want to lecture a younger generation about BIM and that they shouldn't be using BIM, because surely that's where things are heading. But if you ask me, being 55 now, I'd rather keep on working in the Harvey Fagan mode and the way we worked in Kimberley, because if you look at those models that we built, that's what we are. So if I have to change my mode of design and make BIM the channel through which I design, I wouldn't be able to design a building like that. I honestly believe it. And my technical support people say the same. Etienne Brits, who's been fantastic working on this project with us, said BIM doesn't work, Revit doesn't work on this building. It's counterproductive in many ways. And he's on the forum, so maybe we can give him a chance. Thanks, Lionel. I don't know, it's a long answer.
No, that was perfect. Thank you very much.
There's one from Jessica still.
Hi, Henry. Well, thanks for a good answer to the previous question. I think, and for a good talk. As an architect and an urban designer, I think the joy of designing within a framework and the constraints that it offers comes across very clearly in your work. And my question is, especially in South Africa, not all our urban environments offer that sense of conformity or considered restraint for the good of the greater space. You mentioned Sandton. You've got competitive development visions from private developers, or it could be on account of ad hoc urban growth, or simply just the lack of an urban vision or a unified vision for the larger space. So my question is, it's probably a bit of an open question, but how do you tackle, with a single building implementation, an environment that has inconsistent context, where you don't have the luxury of those beautiful constraints?
Yeah, I think, well, thanks for the question, because it just prompted me. You talk about I made the point earlier when I taught at UCT, running that course. Students always ask this question about them and they should, and I always told them, but you are going to have to make these decisions, and it's almost like the council is going to save the day. The city of Cape Town, the council. That's never going to happen. So I think one has to zoom out of this problem a bit and think about in other countries where it works. And for me, I'm increasingly fascinated by the Mexican architecture, the Portuguese architecture, the Spanish architecture, for a reason. It's part of the vernacular is still appreciated, and they still work in that idiom. And part of the problem in South Africa is that we don't value the vernaculars. We post 1994, it was a new start, and so in a way it's not very fashionable to look back because of what South Africa is. Mm-hmm. In those countries, they don't have that problem. It's the continuation of the past. And I wouldn't use the United States as an example, because I think that's where most of our problems come from in terms of what we absorb as architects and where the influences in architecture come from. So the frameworks are even more important. But what is encouraging, your question about the individual building, more recently we've had private clients talking quite intelligently about urban design, making the effort to start understanding it. It's not just a buzzword. The problem often is that if you look at a city like Cape Town, It's the grain of the building. So there was a grid and there were fairly small buildings. And again, if one looks at Sandton, now you've got these massive buildings which are the size of an entire city block. So just that is a massive problem. If those buildings were disaggregated into 10 smaller buildings, then one could start imagining those buildings being in a framework. Now this big, massive sort of campus type building calls itself mixed use. It's not mixed use at all. It's like an ocean liner. It's like it could be floating off Antarctica. It's got a gym on the roof, and it's got a band on the second floor. You can run on that. There's all sorts of things you can do within this funky thing, but it's not good urban design. So the framework absolutely is the tool, but also there's mutual respect amongst architects required. Having worked and studied in England, there's a culture there of architects nominating each other to work on projects. So it's not a competition mechanism like the campuses. It's in the everyday commercial development context, where a practice like Ellis and Morrison will work on a project. They will initiate it, King's Cross, for instance, and then they will invite like-minded architects to do other buildings. So the framework is not that difficult to enforce. Whereas here, we've got this massive competition between architects for survival. And that's what we're seeing, I believe, is the product. So they all talk, urban design, placemaking. I think placemaking is another one of those sins, that everybody now is a placemaker. Whereas placemaking is just a jamboree. It's like a Saturday morning party, and then you call it placemaking. Whereas I think if one looks at these campuses, they are serious placemaking exercises. So Jessica, I haven't been able to answer your question. I just think if there are more like-minded people coming out of universities, really fond of cities, then we're starting to tackle this problem in a serious way. For as long as it's about the culture of the final year project being the coolest, funkiest, sexiest building, we've got a problem. So I would love the day that I walk into a final year exam and somebody asks me what project do I enjoy, and I go to some nondescript building which is spatially resolved, and somebody not laughing at me in the staff, because I've had that, saying, "Are you serious?" And I am serious, because Charles Correa's building wouldn't have been top marks in his final year, I can assure you. So everybody's not Rem Koolhaas. So what I'm saying is there's a problem in terms of the culture of how we as architects engage, but then there's also, when you see an opportunity and there's a client that says we want to work within a framework, that you fully embrace that and start setting examples. So for us in South Africa, unfortunately, we've got this thing about Melrose Arch. People think Melrose Arch is urban design. It is, but what I'm saying is it's just one or two or three that one can point to. It should actually be everywhere. And again, if one builds streets, you build better cities. So it doesn't matter where it is. So the framework is the street. And as long as we don't have public streets, as long as they start becoming private and they are gated, where are we going? It's a massive problem. We've got big problems in this country. And so I haven't answered your question, and I don't really have the answer. It's just a common pursuit of like-minded people, and that's the only way to look at it.
Great. I think that's a great takeaway. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jessica. All right, Henri, your team at URBA, thanks for sharing your experiences as urbanist architects and your artistry of space making with us. I think that has been most inspirational and also very helpful for also my students, I think, or our students rather. And yeah, thanks for all the efforts and time spent, and we're really looking forward to see some of the work continuing and being completed. Thanks, Henri.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to reflect. Thanks, Ludwig. Much appreciated.
Just a comment, we will share just the cover of the presentation for purposes of the registration to CPD points, just for those who have attended. And then our next lecture is Thursday. It's by Niels Skoof from Inside Landscape Architects. That starts at 10 on Thursday, and we're looking forward to seeing you all back again for that one as well. And yeah, all the best. Thank you very much.